This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the second week of October 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. Thank you so much for joining us, and a special thanks to those who are watching the show live on this Thursday afternoon. Really appreciate your time. All right, let's get into it. Joining us once again this week on the show, familiar panel, Luke Thomas of MMAfighting.com and the Sirius XM Fight Club, the man with the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of SportsIllustrated.com, and of course, the man with the hat himself, Chuck Mindenhall of MMAfighting.com. All right, guys, let's start with Rory MacDonald this week, because just yesterday, Dana White told Neil Davidson of the Canadian Press that Rory MacDonald is going to get a title shot finally after his win, of course, on Saturday over Tarek Safdien. That's 3 in a row for the Canadian. And not only that, he's getting the title shot in Canada. They've already announced that. Now, details still up in the air, but it's set in stone, at least for now. Is the UFC making the right call?
I don't see how you can say they're not making the right call. Everyone else who's below him in the rankings, I don't mean that you can't quibble with their positioning, but generally speaking, Condit is below him at this point. Lombard is below him, and Woodley and so forth, guys he's beaten, and guys who are on injury or have other issues. He's better than all of them at this point in the game, has done more recently. I think that loss after a Lawler, how he's really sort of redeemed himself, not just by getting some nice scalps, but the way in which he sort of beat all the guys he beat. Tarek Safdien, again, has no real name, but anybody who knows mixed martial arts knows what a technician he is. And so the way in which he was able to stop him, I thought was kind of impressive. Slow and methodical, but nevertheless overwhelming in the end. I think it's sort of interesting you mentioned Neil Davidson, because he, being Dana White, released the news to Davidson in Canadian media. They want to put this fight in Canada. To me, I don't think that anyone's under the illusion that Rory MacDonald can be what GSP was, but I think they are trying to make sure that they can keep the fire alive in Canada. We talked about this off the air, about the changing television situation there for them. And, they've had some not so great shows in Canada. That's no big secret.
Off. The market is
big time. They want to get back there. They want to hit it hard. Rory MacDonald getting a title shot, potentially, say, in Toronto or wherever it wound up may be, Montreal could be, is the right call for all kinds of right reasons, and it's also about making sure Canada stays hot.
How do you feel about the idea of the challenger in this case? Because he's going to be the challenger fighting in his home country. If you're Johnny Hendricks or Robbie Lawler, whoever wins, how do you feel about that?
You know how I think about that. I can see from your face.
I don't know.
No, I don't like that. I don't like the idea of the challenger getting the home game. It's when we were talking about
Who cares?
about the rematch between Jones and Gustafsson, and they were talking about putting that in Sweden. I don't like that idea. From a meritocracy standpoint, I think that Rory MacDonald is the right man. He's the guy who has earned the title shot. So I think from that perspective, the UFC gets it right. And I think that from the marketing perspective, Rory's not the sexiest guy. And so they're overcoming that. They're saying, well, it's more important that we're going to get the right guy in there. Now, in terms of where they're going to place the fight, I think that the champion should be the one who gets the home game, but from a marketing perspective, it makes total sense. As Luke points out, they're trying to reinvigorate the Canadian market. So from a marketing perspective, I think totally the right call. But there is that part of me that says, if I'm the champion, I want the home game. I want the home game.
Yeah, to me, it doesn't really matter ultimately where they put it. Anderson Silva, for the longest time of a 16-fight streak in the UFC, was fighting in Vegas and other places. He wasn't fighting in Brazil until UFC 134. So we've seen it all ways. They were trying to book, obviously, they were going to have Mendez fighting in Los Angeles, would have been more against Aldo in this next one, which would have been more of his. I just feel like it's more arbitrary for the UFC standpoint. Rory MacDonald, I think you're absolutely right. I feel like they have a guy who could potentially be a champion. I think if he fought any of the guys who are above him right now, I'd probably favor him to beat Lawler in a rematch. I think he was listless in that fight. Probably needed to be rejuvenated and getting that. And even against Hendricks, I think he might. I'd probably favor him a little bit in that fight as well. So he's got a good shot to be that guy. And if you're going to showcase him and you're going to do that, put him in there. And he did them a solid as well. Like, he could have just held out and waited for a fight. He picked up that Halifax fight to kind of give that card the oomph it needed, I guess, for his own to keep things rolling. He's beaten 4 top 10 guys at this point. He's right there. To me, it makes all the sense in the world for them to sort of do it this way.
And also, I just want to clarify. I'm nitpicking here. I'm by no means saying that this was a bad move, the wrong move. I'm just saying that all things being equal, when the challenger gets the home game instead of the champion, I see a little bit of inequity there. But for all the reasons that both Luke and Chuck have pointed out, this is a grand slam for the UFC. If they can reinvigorate that market with this guy who's not really sort of that sexy champion, the sexy fighter who potentially could be a champion.
That's the third time you've used the word sexy.
Yeah. you like that?
No, I don't. That's hilarious.
You were going to say something?
I was just going to say, like, the combat sports world, now this also is more so boxing than mixed martial arts. It's certainly not UFC, but like, and it's not even their fault if it was UFC, but like, how many times has a champion in a hometown gotten a BS decision in their favor, and you have some poor schlub title challenger who probably you could argue I'll never forget, God, who was it? It was Paulie Malignaggi going crazy on Gil Van Hoy in Texas just because he's like, I'm just sick of having other people having hometown advantages, Like, I don't know that it's necessarily, I think whenever you go to a city, it's always going to give that one person who's there for, let's say, Jones and Teixeira. Jones was sort of the adopted hometown guy in Baltimore, and he probably got a little bit of advantage from that. But like the idea that it should always be for the champion, to me, it's like, man, the inequity and the history of mixed martial arts and boxing is so huge. Why not give it to the challenger once in a while?
It's good business, and piggybacking on what you said, I think the timing of the announcement is very interesting because they didn't have to announce it, yesterday, 3 days after his fight. But the UFC is in active negotiations with television outlets in Canada, and Rogers Sportsnet, which signed the NHL recently to a gigantic deal, is probably getting out of the MMA game. All signs point to that. So this, in my opinion, tells the Canadian market that we're coming back, we're bringing a title fight. It's good to be in business with the UFC. There's going to be some rejuvenation as far as the market and the fans are concerned. I think this was a very smart move as far as all that is concerned. Now, you mentioned something that I think is interesting as well. You say that he's not quite GSP or won't be GSP. Why not? Why can't he be that guy? He's dominant. He's maybe good looking to some.
Sexy as hell.
Dare I say sexy? Why can't he be GSP?
Let's just be real. He can be a lot, I think. First of all, he has to start winning. Second of all,
What do you mean start winning?
Well, he has those 2 losses, and
one was a little controversial, right? Condit.
No, he got roughed up in that 3rd round, dude. That was a beating.
If that would have lasted 6 more seconds, he probably would have won the fight.
Okay, but he was catching an ass whipping.
Fair enough, and then you lose the same amount of losses as GSP.
All right, but GSP had a meteoric rise to the top, and again, I always talk about that Frank Trigg fight. Rory MacDonald never had that breakout moment where he was like, remember that was, for folks who may not remember, Frank Trigg was the guy for a while, and GSP fought him and just blitzkrieged him. And then that was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the fight where he got on his knees and begged for the title shot, And it was just this, you can't even talk about that moment in any way related to Rory MacDonald's career. Moreover, GSP was a hot Canadian star when the market was hot and when MMA was hot. It's a different, we were talking about this last week, like how do you define success for Conor McGregor? I don't know the answer to that because he's competing in a totally different environment now. So this isn't to say that Rory MacDonald can't be important, big, crazy stuff, and even I could be wrong. He could match GSP. I just feel like that was catching lightning in a bottle, and this is a different era.
You said, I think last week, that GSP may not be as big in a place like Winnipeg or in Vancouver on the West Coast, but it's more of an Eastern guy, the French Canada, and it's funny because he was thoroughly French Canadian. He's a guy that was really in that mark. Well, Rory is more based in British Columbia.
Right.
It's a little different. He's not going to maybe go into Montreal. I don't know where they're planning on doing it. It seems like the timing of this might actually end up in a place like Montreal because they've been there in March. You've got the December 6th fight for the title and all that. Like they might be gearing towards something like that again. But I feel like he's sort of I don't think he corners a very specific market like and it kind of grows out from that. I feel like he's more amorphous than that. He's just as a guy who was a transplant in that area, and I don't know how many Canadians right now feel like, oh, he belongs to us. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and of course they were in Vancouver in June. He fought in the co-main event. That card did not sell out. So clearly he hasn't made that connection just yet. I think it's also interesting, Dana White said not that long ago that when GSP comes back, because they believe he's coming back, he'll get a title shot. Now if they're going to Montreal in around March or April or so for this title fight, does that mean, because I thought all roads were leading to GSP returning in Canada, getting a title shot. Does that mean that you don't give GSP the title shot and then could you imagine a card, Rory MacDonald, Canadian, going for the belt, GSP, Canadian hero, returning in the co-main event in somewhere like Montreal, all of a sudden that market is not so cool anymore. I mean, it's very hot, if you know what I'm saying. Do you think that they now not give him the title shot? Let's just assume he's coming back a year after the ACL injury. Everyone, including his coach, believes he's coming back. Do you think that he goes for the title shot, he goes for like the co-main event slot right away, or do they save him, roll the dice that Roy wins the belt, and now again we're faced with that dilemma? It's an interesting thing, right?
I would depend entirely who he wants to fight. I don't think he would want to fight for the title right away. Or maybe, I don't know.
You don't think so?
It's hard to read. I don't know what he would want or not want. But I would be interesting that if he did, let's say they gave him a co-main event slot, it was against somebody credible, but he could beat. And then if Rory did become the champion, it would set up this really sort of impossible scenario between the two that would. But
if you're the UFC, would you put him in a title fight right away?
God, I don't know how you answer that.
As a promoter,
were I matchmaker, would I do it right away?
Yeah,
no, I would not do it right away.
Why?
I would give him somebody he can look good against first, and then I would do it.
Even if, let's say, Johnny Hendricks is the champion, you don't do that rematch.
If Hendricks stays champion, that changes the equation a little bit. But if it's Lawler or MacDonald, you give him someone else in the interim, and then that sort of creates a setup.
Crazy talk, especially if it's MacDonald. You got to make that fight
right away.
Absolutely. Why roll the dice? What do you think?
Well, if it's MacDonald right away, then we're talking farther down the road.
Exactly.
Right? So it takes. But if we're talking about them fighting on the same card, I would not push MacDonald out of the title shot and throw GSP in there, but I would give him that one fight to sort of right the ship and get him get his sea legs under him again.
Although worth noting that GSP in the main event in Montreal fighting for the belt upon returning would probably, that could sell 80,000 tickets, right? Do we not agree? That's a bigger fight than Roy MacDonald fighting for the belt, but it's not the right thing to do. You're saying
any GSP fight is bigger than a Roy MacDonald fight.
Given these circumstances, returning, retirement, all that stuff, I feel like there's a renewed interest in the guy.
If I'm the promoter, 33 years old, you don't know how long he wants to go. He's won 12 fights in a row, he has 9 title defenses. You're going to look at that and say, there's no way. If you're the promoter and you don't know what you're going to get in the future, you're going to want to maximize his appearances. So I would put him in the title fight right away, so long as he was okay with that. As he wanted to do it, I'd be like, regardless of which guy he's facing, that's the fight I would make.
And this is a bridge the UFC has not yet crossed. We just saw Dominic Cruz fighting in the prelims, but it was a 3-year layoff after 3 separate serious injuries. And so it made sense for him to not immediately go into a title fight. We've seen other cases of guys who have come back from a long layoff, but there's always been some kind of extra little something that we had to account for. With GSP, it was essentially his mind. He just wasn't ready to fight anymore. And so if he says he's going to come back, we can assume that mentally he's ready to jump right back in. So I would put him in a title fight as soon as he's ready, but I wouldn't cancel a title fight in order to insert him.
I may feel a little, more. I may be a little more interested in this story than you guys as a Canadian. I think this is one of the most fascinating stories to watch in 2015. How are they going to deal with this whole situation? Because, tell me if you disagree. Everyone assumes he's coming back, right? At this point,
seems that way.
Everyone assumes he's coming back. So what are they going to do? How are they going to deal with these moving parts? In the co-main event on Saturday in Halifax, Rafael Sunsao, which it's interesting to talk about Rafael right now because he's won 7 in a row. He has a win over the champion, and yet he's given the mic in the post-fight interview and essentially does nothing to state his case that he is being robbed of a title shot and Dominic is getting it before him and all this stuff. What more does this guy have to do? He has a win over the champion. He even comes on the MMA Hour on Monday and, quite frankly, does nothing to convince anyone that A, he deserves it, and B, he wants it. And that's the most interesting thing in my opinion. Isn't it amazing at this stage in the sport when you see things like Conor McGregor possibly getting a title shot after just 4 wins and leapfrogging guys who may be more deserving, that there are still people out there like a Sunsao who are not trying to take the bull by the horns, cry foul, start some kind of campaign. Look what Rory did right after. He was banging the drum. He was telling everyone, I want that title shot. And yet you still have guys who are sitting back and waiting. To me, it's just like, if you don't care, I don't care anymore.
You have to be who you are. Ultimately, I think that fighters have to be who they are, and you can't manufacture. Well, I guess you can try to manufacture, but most of us will see right through it.
But we're not asking to put on a show and do some shtick. If you want it, tell us.
He could have done better, but I don't think he is being. I think that someone like Cub Swanson or Frankie Edgar would have a much stronger case about them being leapfrogged without a good reason. I think that. I think it's hard to argue against Dominic Cruz, a champion who never lost his belt. How can you argue against him being the next guy in line? So while I do agree with you that Sunsao could could better his case, I'm not sure he was going to change anything.
What's funny to me is it wasn't even that he didn't, bang his own drum. It's like he was almost reverent in interviews I've heard about Dominic Cruz's performance and saying, like, I could kind of understand why the UFC might want to do that. You know what I'm saying? And he is in a weird position. Not that he should be making this case, but he is in a weird position from the outside looking in because obviously Dominic Cruz never gave up his belt. He had the layoff with the injuries and everything else. So he's still essentially defending his belt. We could look at it this way.
Sure.
He's going against TJ Dillashaw, who's mimics him and now and everything. He's defending his belt. He's got two guys defending their belts now in front of him, and then he's got other guys sort of like the big needle mover in the division being Uriah Faber, whom he's fought in 2010, I think it was. He's lingering out there. So in some ways,
He wants nothing to do with Faber.
And he wants nothing to do with Faber. But I'm almost like, from the outside, you want to say like, well, you lost to Faber. At least show some hunger maybe in wanting to rematch Faber, and then you have like a definitive like analyzing into that title shot, and especially in this situation because, let's face it, if Faber's had a lot of title shots, if he loses against the Sunsao, you're like, well, he didn't get his next one. He didn't get up there again. If Sunsao loses, you're like, well, we lose the Sunsao. That sort of uncomplicates that. And now we got Faber back into a match with one of those two guys, maybe Dillashaw teammates, or you know what I'm saying? To me, it makes sense to have a Faber fight, but at least be hungry towards one of these things. Right now, I feel like a Sunsao is just being too polite on all levels.
It's confusing because this is a sport where your digital footprint makes a big difference. And on Twitter, there was a long time where he was like, "This is crazy. This is BS. This is my title shot." And then you put a mic in front of him, and it's like something just switched. I don't know what to explain that exactly. But it's funny to me, that's one problem. The other one that's kind of crazy, in boxing, you definitely get guys who battle on Twitter, and you definitely get people who give, crazy interviews, and Adrian Broner comes to mind. But a lot of sort of the media narrative is often pushed by managers. I think they take a bit of a back seat, or power players in a person's inner circle anyway, and those people take a back seat in MMA interviews. But even in that world, and I don't want to spoil the video, so I'm going to tell you very little bit about it, so you should go to SB Nation's boxing blog, Bad Left Hook. There is a video, because he wants a fight so bad, of Shannon Briggs getting in a boat and heckling Vladimir Klitschko. It's the most insane thing I think I've ever seen in my life. But it just might work. I mean, I don't know if it will or not.
Crazier than War Machine's Slurpee thing that was going on.
Well, that was. But see, if he didn't name an opponent except for the lady who made him take off his hood in the video. I can't believe I watched that thing. Anyway, I just mean to say that, like, even in a world where other power players do like the heavy lifting for you, Shannon Briggs, as crazy and a lunatic as it is, gets in a boat. And it created headlines, and it worked. And again, a fight hasn't been booked, but at least he's generated some kind of attention. Assunção, if he wants to talk about it on Twitter, look around, man. There's only really one way to get there. You can get 7, 8, 9 wins in a row, but if you show just sort of like a lack of enthusiasm for everything, they will respond in kind.
It's also interesting, you point out that this all comes down to that post-fight interview. And so we're at the point where these guys are going out and competing, and all that, that adrenaline from competition, suddenly they're in front of a microphone and they have to, in a sense, compete again, or at least show them perform again. Let's put it that way. And some guys are better able. Some guys are a little bit debilitated from the performance that they just put on as in the cage as a fight. Now they're having to perform again. They're having to state their case a second time. And I guess that Assunção, as you said, Assunção did say some things on Twitter and has stated his case here and there. It was almost as though he was kind of resigned to the fact that it was already announced that that this guy Dominic Cruz is going to take the shot. I'm not going to be the next guy. I guess his thing that he could have done was call out somebody else, whether it be Faber or even Barao. Seems to me that Barao is closer to the top than Uriah Faber is.
But I still think even if it's in Brazil, fight against Faber, a rematch, is bigger than the Barao fight. And also, I kind of want to see Barao take a break. I mean, Assunção doesn't have to care about that, but as a human being, I feel like that guy should be on the shelf for quite some time after the second half of the year that he's had, right? Pretty traumatic stuff. He was beat up, put back in a fight 3 months later. Who knows what happened to his body while trying to cut weight. No one can deny that Uriah Faber is the biggest star in that division. He's bigger than Cruz. He's bigger than Dillashaw still, right? That's a bigger fight.
For now.
That's a bigger fight. That's a headlining fight. I don't know if Rafael Assunção could even go into Brazil. Other than Jose Aldo, he's probably the hottest MMA fighter in the UFC right now. Like, he has a very impressive streak. He's undefeated at bantamweight. Like, he has a strong resume. I don't even know if he can go to Brazil against a Barao or someone else and even sell out or make some kind of dent in that market, which says a lot about how he's presenting himself. And we don't have to, give him advice or, if he does, like I said, if he doesn't care, we shouldn't care. But it's just amazing to me at this stage in the game that guys don't understand that if you don't bang the drum, if you don't make noise, it's not going to lead to more money, fame, all that other stuff.
Atlanta. It's like he lives in Atlanta.
Yeah,
it's
he speaks
like,
English very well as well.
English very well. So a lot of his story is just completely untold.
We can't assume, though, that he doesn't care. I think that is a bit of a leap.
That's the way he comes across.
I think he comes across as a guy who's going to take what he gets. And there are a lot of guys out there that do that. Some people just are better at that. Some people throw better kicks. Some people are better at takedowns. Some people are better on the mic than others, and I think we just have to accept that.
I think all these fighters think they're Greg Popovich, man.
Yeah.
If you don't know who Greg Popovich is, because I know you donkeys don't watch sports, but he's the coach of the San Antonio Spurs.
The what?
So any sideline reporter, you'd be like Greg Popovich, they go, Greg, what's the key to getting ahead in the second half? More points, and then he walks off. Like, he doesn't talk at all. You got, I don't know when fighters are going to realize that post-fight interview, this is not like a coach being interviewed in between halftime at a college football game and they say 2 words and they go on because they have a media obligation. The post-fight interview, be it Anik or Rogan or whoever it is, that is a huge thing of importance. It's like with the one sport where talking to a sideline reporter is a big deal, and they don't seem to quite understand that. It's the truth. Those post-fight interviews, along with other ones, are of crazy importance.
It's almost like he's got a sense of humility. I think it's like he'll tell you like.
And he's not the only one, by the way. Let's not pick on him.
He's like that. But I have had a conversation with him, and he understands what we're talking about. I think he understands that people want him to do this because he was saying that he's got a couple of brothers who train in MMA. They're always bugging him. He said his parents in Brazil will always ask him, "Why don't you talk to Sean Shelby? Let's get the title fight. Why can't you get the title fight?"
Yeah.
He'll tell you that stuff. It's just somehow it doesn't register for him to actually pursue it. I don't know. It's almost like he has a mental tick not to be insistent on things. Like you know what I mean? Like he doesn't feel like he can jump out there.
Bermudez is the same way at 145. Cup Swanson, many others. He is obviously in the news these days because he just picked up that win. Now 7 in a row. It'll be interesting to see what they do with him. Let's move along. Speaking of welterweights, we were talking about welterweights earlier. Royce Gracie, right? I mean, this is a guy who
That's a name I haven't heard from.
Yes, he's a pretty big deal in our sport.
I've heard of him.
It was announced yesterday that he is the new global brand ambassador for Bellator MMA, not the UFC. Last time we really saw him associated with the UFC was at UFC 167, their 20th anniversary show. They brought him out. He was a big part of the UFC. I mean, he is. The beginning of the pay-per-view starts with him and Ken Shamrock, right? Be interesting to see what happens with that. So, what do we make of this? Is this a big deal? Is this a big deal for Bellator? Do you expect the UFC to react? Is this just some kind of PR play? He's going to sign autographs and people will forget about it in 4 months? How are we digesting this news?
It's definitely nothing that Bjorn Rebney would have done.
It's amazing how many different things they're doing as opposed to that.
It's crazy. Like the new Coca regime sort of believes in making you want to like things. You know what I mean? Like, let's make this a pleasant experience.
Exactly right.
Which I don't think that Rebney's appreciated quite as much. I don't know if that means the biggest thing in the world. We talked about this before the show. He certainly has some name value. They also mentioned to be part of South American efforts, and I would think by that they mean, remember they have that new Fox Sports deal going on in Brazil. I think that kicks in 2015, so that'll be a key component to the extent that they can get him down there. It's not the end of the world, but it's just sort of funny that Coker's playbook is like, all right, got Bellator under my tutelage here and under my control. Got back on Spike. All right, let's do the Spike playbook. Let's get Tito Ortiz. Let's get Bonner. Let's get Royce Gracie. And this is not the end of it. Who else are they going to get? I don't know. And of course, Rampage was already there. I'm sure he'll come into a big important role in 2015. So it's just kind of interesting to me that they went back to what made Spike what it was with UFC and. What kind of effect it'll have, marginal, but nevertheless, it's symbolic in really important ways.
Well, there are. You said who's next? I mean, there are 8 more UFC Hall of Famers.
That's true.
Dan Severn they're going to get.
Yeah, they've got 4 of the 12
Jason
so
Thacker.
far. It's like yesterday I was tweeting that this was like the Agatha Christie novel, and then there were none. One by one they disappear from the mansion and head over to the dark side of Bellator. But the thing that's puzzling to me about this is, I mean, it's not a huge deal, but there is something symbolic. I think that was a good word they used there, Luke. There's something symbolic about this guy who it's not going to affect any of the people who are watching this show right now. All the people who are hardcore fans they know what the landscape looks like. But there are all these casual folks these other general sports fans who the UFC and Bellator is trying to reach, and anytime you can muddy the waters a little bit, if you're Bellator, and muddy the waters a little bit about what this really means. Who is this guy? This guy Gracie. I've heard of him. He's a famous guy. He must have been part. He's with Bellator. He must have been part of their history. Anytime you can do that, I think it's a good move for them. And I wonder how the UFC. I wonder how this kind of transpired because, I can't imagine they're paying Royce Gracie a ton of money. And I'm wondering if once the money was offered to him, if he went to the UFC and said, hey, Bellator wants me to be a brand ambassador, and if the UFC would, either match or give him something to keep him on board. Because, why would the UFC want to see this kind of muddying of the waters out there? It just seems like it's a little bit odd.
Yeah, it's a little bit like there's more positive energy associations, like you're saying, to like some more positive things, like bringing guys like that in. I know it's an interesting thing because this happened, with ONE FC bringing in Rich Franklin. You sort of have this guy who's a UFC, former champion. All of a sudden, they want him to be the sort of face and to break into new markets and to use him in those types of ways. I sort of look at it a little bit like that because I think Royce Gracie obviously has the name. He sort of has this iconic thing behind him. He has a positive vibe. I know that, and he has a magnetism too. It's really true. Whenever you see him in person and he is out at events, it brings like a level of reverence that you don't see with every fighter. I know that I went out and interviewed him in Charlotte, North Carolina, and he was talking at a police academy, and then he went out and did some public appearances. I just sort of followed him around, and it was really interesting to see all the people, the way they react to him. It was like, Wilt Chamberlain, I don't know, like
Michael Jordan.
Icon. Yeah,
people
like
call him the Michael Jordan
really
of MMA,
like
whether or not that's true.
That association.
It's true, they call him that.
That's true.
Absolutely. If you talk to a casual fan
he's not
who
a
knows
Travis
nothing
Luter
about... Yeah, right. They say, oh, Gracie. Everyone knows Gracie.
Did they not see the Mac Hughes fight?
No. There's no way.
We
They haven't seen anything.
I sort of jokingly mentioned the 12 members of the UFC Hall of Fame. This is the Babe Ruth. I mean,
Right.
imagine this is 1940, and there's some newfangled baseball organization wants to start a league that's going to compete with Major League Baseball, and they bring Babe Ruth along to kind of be the face of their organization or to be an ambassador. That would be a big deal. I mean, in a kind of a weird, kind of back rooms kind of way. That's what they're doing. They're bringing the guy who is the Babe Ruth of the sport. And I know that you're scoffing
The
at
Babe
me.
Ruth, the Michael Jordan. He's all that.
But this is the way people view him. It's a name that's synonymous with the rise of the UFC.
Well, I just feel like it takes on a little bit more weight because of how adversarial UFC is with its contemporaries.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how they respond, right?
All right, but I just mean one thing, a quick story about this that I think would it's about getting visibility for Bellator, right? That's what it's got to be, because I remember when the War Machine stuff was going on, by the time it reached Nancy Grace, there's a local morning show on the station I used to work at. It's a sports radio station, it's the Junkies, and they were talking about the War Machine issue, and they were like, yeah, actually to Dana White's point, they actually didn't mention the War Machine was a UFC fighter. They mentioned that he was a Bellator fighter. And all the other panelists on the show were like, "What's Bellator?" I think Royce Gracie, to some extent, is going to try and plug that hole. At least they know what it is. They have some sense. Maybe you only like Premier League, but yeah, you've heard of the Seattle Sounders, and you know about the DC United or something like that. I think it's just trying to raise the bottom of it so it's the base level of understanding of Bellator is a little bit higher.
It's funny because obviously, like when you think of Royce Gracie, you think of the original UFCs, you think of UFC.
Sure.
So it just sort of shares
You think of
that.
MMA though too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
True.
You don't think of the modern
That's
UFC.
true.
I think
Absolutely.
people think of
and
that.
emblematically almost like an underdog who was brought into that. So one of the reasons he is who he is because he transcended the game right away by showing the jiu-jitsu and everything, and he was sort of an underdog, this every man who showed up and beat these giants. Well, he's now in an underdog role sort of again. It's just sort of like those sort of associations.
MMA, UFC, these are words that are synonyms for most of the sports public. People who are not diehard fans of the sport, they don't really see a difference between UFC and MMA. They see these things as one thing. And so the more that, it doesn't matter if Bellator, I mean, it would be nice if Bellator gets its name out there, but just the fact that they can break that bond between MMA and the UFC and make it a world where the word MMA means more than the UFC, that's a victory for Bellator. If Royce Gracie can help them do that, that's a positive for them.
Yeah, and let's not kid ourselves. I mean, people aren't going to tune in to Spike TV to watch Royce Gracie sitting cage side or anything. It's nothing more than a PR move, but it's an interesting, turn of events from the old regime, right? And they're bringing these guys and trying to be fan friendly and honoring the past and things like that. It's completely different than what Bjorn did, and it's really completely different than what Scott did back in the day with Strikeforce.
It's a different task. Even for example, they said he was going to do like autograph signings and appearances. those are going to be tied to live events too.
Yeah.
Day before and day of, because they need to get people through the gate.
Right.
Because if they want to go to bigger and better venues, they need a reason for those guys to go. That's why people don't know, why are there 1,000 donks on Bellator undercards? Those are the guys that sell the tickets.
Right, yeah.
Got news for you. Michael Chandler's not selling tickets. He's a tremendous talent, but he doesn't move units in that way. But I feel like small steps aggregately, like having Royce show up at places, can sort of fix some of these problems.
Let's talk about Cung Le. Last week on the show, we spoke about him at length, and the story has evolved very much so. Right after the show, he put out a statement, and at first I feel like the MMA community, us included, kind of rolled, really, he's going to fight this. He's going to say, how many guys have tried to fight their drug test failures and said that there was a mistake, or I'm innocent, all this stuff, and especially considering his interview leading up to the fight, talking about the lighting and whatnot, it was kind of really, are we really going to go through this? But now more information has started to come out about the issues involved with that test, which went to a lab in Hong Kong, and major players, major experts in this world are saying there's an issue here, that he should appeal this, that he actually wasn't potentially in the wrong, and now it's come out that he will have a chance to appeal, which is interesting, I think, because that wasn't a foregone conclusion. That had to actually come out and be told to the media. So, of course, we don't know if he has a case or not, but there's something there. There is smoke to this fire, when I think last week when we were talking about this, we all kind of felt like there wasn't. How do we feel about the whole process, though? The appeals process. This never even, and I'll admit, it never even really crossed my mind, which is crazy. In other sports, a lot of guys will appeal all kinds of things. Like when someone gets caught in the UFC, I never even think, is this guy going to appeal it? It just kind of, all right, it's there's a press release and let's move on. He's the first one that's almost challenging it. And I find that to be very interesting. Do you feel like this is going to change the way things are done?
Well, first of all, no one's going to want to admit this, certainly here, or maybe you guys will, I don't know. First of all, media pressure, in part by Cung and his management, but also people writing articles about this, I think helped persuade the UFC that something should be done about this. I could be patting myself on the back. Not that I wrote the articles, but I just been looking around as a media member. I think that actually kind of had an effect. But that aside, I tried to contact before the show the American Arbitration Association. They don't disclose details about individual cases. If you want to look at the protocol of what can be found for individual things after the fact, they will release that. But ahead of time and during, they don't talk about it. So it's going to be interesting to see how they do that. But I know they get a panel of experts relevant to the situation and whatnot. But I just think it's kind of interesting. Like, I still am very suspicious about Cung Le. Like, he looked the way he looked. And he was like, and his answers were like, yeah, this time I got 8 hours of sleep and,
sure.
I ate kale. It's like, that's how you got to look like that? Okay. But the point about it is, and you can look, so I don't want to exaggerate the claim, but you can sort of look at our own criminal justice system. You can have somebody guilty as sin. It is irrelevant. They are entitled to due process. They are entitled to have their rights read. They are entitled to have a jury of their peers. They are allowed to, if they want, waive the trial. They are allowed to have an attorney present if they can't afford one. And these things matter because you're supposed to have a level of justice, quote unquote, provided to make sure everything is adjudicated properly. And yes, things fall through the crack. But if a guy is getting his blood taken after the fact, if they're using a laboratory that does autism medical testing, which, oh my God, that makes my skin crawl to even hear something like that. Those things are giant red flags. So do I necessarily believe that Cung Le is innocent? I don't know, but I do know that he is entitled, because all clean athletes, and he might be one, are entitled to a fair due process.
I think that his due process could very well clear him. I think that his representative already has thrown in a lot of things that are kind of creating reasonable doubt, and that's his job. I mean, he's not there to say that Cung Le is innocent, or he's there to cast doubts on this process. And I think actually this is a good thing. I really do. Obviously, the UFC did not get this right. By that lab they chose, and by letting the lab get rid of the B sample, and you could list a million different things that they did wrong. But it's good that this is all happening, first of all, the first time they're doing this kind of testing, and it's also good it's happening with a fighter who is really at the end of his career and who's not a relevant fighter. If this were to be if the first time this happened, it was in the case of somebody who was, say, one of the contenders in one of your weight classes, and now you have to have this big, drawn-out process, and maybe he'll get clear, but maybe he was really guilty, and you didn't cross all the T's and dot all the I's in your process. I think that the UFC it's a work in progress. This whole blood testing thing is a work in progress. They've claimed, Dana White claimed, and I think it was an ESPN story that was up yesterday, that from now on they will be only using WADA labs, and so they seem to have, after the fact, sort of got it all together. And I realize that it would have been better if they had gotten it together in the beginning, but they claim, well, it was an 11th hour decision to do this. You can beat them up for that, but I'm just going to say at least they tried. They didn't get it right, but now through whatever forces, through Cung Lee's representative, through the media, through other people, they're going to get it right. At least they're going to give it a better shot at getting it right.
I really believe the same thing that you're saying is basically they came to the conclusion to do all of this fairly quickly. They probably didn't think of all the protocol that they were going to follow themselves, who was going to go. They probably did not have the foresight to really think those things through. If UFC themselves always defers to the commission in situations where there is a commission. So that's the commission's problem, it's a government issue, blah, blah, blah. Well, when they act as their own commission, I think they're learning that they have to mimic that same commission as clearly as they can. So that if the Nevada Athletic Commission uses WADA, and that's what they do, and even in enhanced testing, whatever it is, whatever amount that they're doing, they still got to go by those WADA protocols. I feel like they got to, they're still putting that stuff together. This particular one was sort of a cram session. I think that they were like, you know what, let's go ahead and do this. We're here. Maybe there was suspicion. Michael Bisping was the one who sort of brought it up. Maybe they did it. But as soon as, I don't think everybody really understood either, even within the UFC, the complication of testing for, HGH, things like that, how hard it is. There's the WADA, the 32 WADA labs that they were talking about, those places have specified, how to test that and those sort of things. That's a lot of stuff to process in a thing that you're throwing together. So I feel like this was sort of let's try it and hope it all works out. They found, he pops hot. And obviously now he's got a very good case to sort of be like, hey, but look at all this stuff. It sheds light on it. Now all of us are going to be educated as much as the UFC is. And it probably, it sets up further going down the road in 2015 when they really get behind it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I just think about Nick Diaz and his case in Nevada, and he was originally busted marijuana for, he's got other issues now.
The second one.
Yeah, but it was just a urine test, This is why I think commissions, partly from a budgetary issue, but I think that's why they shy away from a lot of blood testing stuff, because it's complicated and has to be done in very precise ways. Because with marijuana, not to get too distracted, the urine test only tells you that they used. It does not tell you when they used. Only blood will tell you that. And so, the idea is don't want someone competing high, but a urine test doesn't tell you anything like that. So, and he was trying to say that these are sort of countervailing reasons that should be considered. But blood testing is extraordinarily potent and therefore requires everything to be precise. The timing of the testing, the delivery, the mechanism you use to store it, all that stuff has to be right. It's hard to do well, and it's why I like that they're testing all these guys year round, but I really hope they get it right in terms of the agency they choose, the third-party agency, because they're going to be responsible for all of those different things in the chain of custody. And so if you don't get that right, you're still not going to do it right, because fans just think, what's random testing? It's the guy showing up and taking your blood, and that's the end of it, and so something happens after the fact. But it's really the smallest part is taking your blood. It's all the rest of that stuff. So making sure they get a third-party administration or organization to get that right is critical.
My biggest takeaway is our sport is so young. We forget how young and how many more mistakes are to come. I mean, you compare this to the NFL. HGH testing was a major talking point. It was a major negotiation point, right? Like they had to fight for this to happen. And in our sport, it's just like, okay, we're going to start doing it. The fighters have no say in any of this, and they've made mistakes along the way, and they're going to figure it out. I'm sure of that. But even with, as you mentioned, what's happening next year, I mean, who knows what kind of mistakes will happen then? And with other things that have happened just in the past year alone, it's just amazing when you stop and think sometimes, like, talk about uniforms and all this stuff. Like the sport is just so young, and we compare our sport, in particular the UFC, to the NFL, and it's not the NFL. It's really not. I mean, it couldn't be any different. People always compare Dana White to Roger Goodell. He's not Roger Goodell. He's just an owner of an organization. He's not the commissioner. He's not the end-all be-all. It's not a fair comparison. He's Mark Cuban. He's Jerry Jones. He's closer to them, in my opinion, than he is to a commissioner. And that's no knock on him. That's just the facts. He's not overseeing, a group of teams or whatever. It's a completely different beast. And there are just so many.
He's both.
Well,
that's the weird. That's
international territory.
That's the weird thing.
It's totally different. That's why you can't compare him.
He's Roger Goodell, and Jerry Jones somehow morphed into some mixture that doesn't really retain the qualities of either, in a sense. I mean, he is overseeing,
Yeah.
and yet he's also an owner. And therein lies one of the big issues that we have to always wrestle with.
And you mentioned something about Cung Lee. You said, at least it's someone like Cung, and it's not, a young contender, a Rory MacDonald, let's say. But still, I mean, we will not know here. We can't say definitively if he's guilty or innocent. But you have to feel for the guy. I mean, everyone has essentially decided that he is guilty. This is a guy who has a movie career coming up. I mean, he's got a lot. He's not 80 years old. He still has a life. If you Google Cung Lee right now, everything that comes up on the front page is him being a cheater. So you have to feel for him, at least right now.
Sure, and I wasn't saying it in that context. I mean, I actually think that in the end he's going to be cleared. I think that
there are enough red flags.
I think there's going to be enough red flags that the UFC.
There's no B sample.
There's no B sample. I think that they're going to be able. He's going to get off. So I think in the end, and that's what I'm talking about. That if somebody who's been doing things illegally, who does not get punished for it because the process was screwed up. And I don't know what, I'm not going to say whether Cung Lee was doing anything illegal or not. I'm just going to say that if that were the scenario, I'd rather that scenario unfold with an older fighter who was sort of hanging on, and if he continues his fighting career and moves on to movies, great. But if it's some guy who is like one of the young guns of the sport, and then there's a big cloud that's hung over him because of technicalities, then I think there would have been a bigger faux pas on the part of the UFC.
Guys, there is no UFC this weekend. In fact, the UFC is off for 2 weekends leading up to UFC 179.
Which fresh air, man.
Which I think is interesting because I want to see how much more interest there will be in UFC 179. Distance sometimes makes the heart grow fonder, and it might not be their strongest card, but I even feel like 2 weeks later, come UFC 179, people will be a little more amped up for that card because they've had a chance to relax and catch their breath. Point is, no UFC, but there is still MMA. There's a lot of MMA once again this weekend. Bellator has actually a fairly solid card on Saturday.
Super important card for Friday, you mean?
Did I say Saturday?
Yeah.
My mistake. Friday. Dantas, Warren, title fight, MVP, Michael Venom Page. In my opinion, must-see TV. But I want to talk about World Series of Fighting for a second because they're in such a weird spot. They have a show this weekend. It's in Canada. Jake Shields making his debut, which seems strange. It feels like he already made his debut for some reason because it feels like it was so long ago that he was signed. Of course, he was supposed to fight in July. That didn't happen. But their next 2 shows after that are on the same night as the Bellator UFC events on November 15th, and then they're on the same night as UFC on Fox 13 on December 13th. They're in such a weird spot. It's like I feel like we talk about them quite often on the show. We have like a little State of the Union address, and I just can't put my finger on what they're trying to accomplish, along with NBC, who seems to put them in these tough spots of having to prove themselves up against the biggest UFC shows. I mean, how do we feel about... I know how we feel about Bellator, I feel at this point. I think they're doing interesting things and they're rebranding, but I just can't describe World Series of Fighting. I don't know what they're trying to do. I don't know what the mission statement is. Can you help me out?
So there's one way to look at all these things and say, what portion of the market are you filling? And that gives you some indication of where they are and what they do. But even then, that's not the most helpful way. I was thinking about this in the train right up. The better question to ask is, what are they solving for? What is the gap in mixed martial arts that they are solving? So, for example, locally, in DC, we have Operation Octagon. That's where all the major schools send their rising students to get amateur experience. And then there's King of the Cage, so maybe a step up from that. And then all various other, Cage Fury Fighting Championships or Ring of Combat. And then you get sort of up the way. And all these different organizations, they solve for something. You're a regional feeder. You're an amateur show.
Yeah.
You're the UFC. World Series of Fighting doesn't solve for anything except for maybe NBC needing some extra sports content at an affordable price. It's a place that's a repository for guys who've been cut from the major leagues, whether they've been cut fairly or not. And it's a place where, yes, they have produced some young up-and-coming stars, Justin Gaethje and so forth, and Nick Newell, I think, has gotten a big name there. Maybe he wouldn't have gotten someplace else. It's all dependable. But organizationally, if they didn't exist, would it fundamentally change MMA? No. No, it would not. Even if Bellator went away, you'd say, oh, damn, well, Viacom got out of the business. That's important. If World Series went away, I'm not saying I wouldn't have fond memories of some of their shows or that they didn't try hard or they aren't good guys, but it would just be gone.
What's your greatest World Series fighting memory? What are these fond memories?
Well, listen, he didn't go very well for him, but I kind of feel like it was, I always thought they treated Nick Newell really well. And I liked the way when they put him on shows, they talked about his disability and then they moved on. And I thought that was the fairest treatment he's ever got from any promoter ever. To me, that's kind of important.
Fair point. What do you make of them right now?
I find them kind of puzzling myself. It's because on the one hand, there's this kind of weirdly cozy relationship with the UFC. You know, we saw Berkman move over from there over to the UFC, and so there's been others before that. So there's a kind of coziness with the UFC, and yet they're also kind of counter-programming the UFC at different times. Not always directly. Sometimes one of their fight cards not too long ago was held in the afternoon, the same time as there was UFC at night.
Newell versus Gaethje.
Yeah. So they offer a free TV alternative to watching UFC, which certainly has to, I don't know to what degree, but certainly has to cut into a UFC audience to some degree. So I'm not quite sure. They're not avoiding the UFC, and then on the other hand, they're also kind of being cozy
but
and friendly.
I feel like that's NBC doing that. You know what I mean? I don't know if the guys, given their relationships with the UFC, the matchmakers and whatnot, the executives are saying, we're going to go, like Ray Sefo, Ali Abdelaziz. I mean, just today, Ali tells Guilherme Cruz at MMA Fighting that they're not doing pay-per-view anymore. They just sent out a press release, game changer, last week. How could things have changed? They need to get their ducks in a row, and it's become a lot more evident that that's not the case.
Then they also say that their next card was going to be bigger than the Bellator and UFC events, or something along that line. I mean, so I do feel like it's that just when you start to think you might have a fix, it's almost like mercury on you're trying to like touch it and it just move somewhere else. It's like they're hard to really put your finger on, at least for me.
That's funny.
No, I agree. To me, I cannot figure out the identity. I thought you said it perfectly. To me, they're just an organization. Like if you remove them from everything, I'm not sure what it would be. The only thing I really saw, it's like I thought that they wanted to make themselves a viable, if not a competition to the UFC. They were going to be, something in that space. They're going to be some kind of competition for the MMA space. They're going to sign some of these guys. They're going to give them. It was sort of cool because guys who were unjustly cut or just still had fight in them could go to this organization, make a paycheck. It was cool on those levels. But as we kind of go on, I just don't see the direction that they're heading. And part of the thing that always kind of gets me, it goes back to even Strikeforce with the Coker-led Strikeforce at the time. People really like to figure out what's in the wings of things. What are the stakes?
Yep.
What's after this? When can you never really know with World Series fighting what's coming next. You don't know the divisions are not filled out enough.
Sure.
People move, they come and go too quickly. The stars, there just aren't enough of them coming up the ranks. It's just that there's nothing there. So there's a little bit of intrigue when guys like Jake Shields debut this week, and you want to see what he's got. He hasn't fought since March. What does he do? How does he look, etc. Maybe he fights the winner of Fitch and Paul Harris. Well, you've got a little bit of something, but it really doesn't. That's an exception. I almost feel like that's as much as they can possibly put together in terms of a horizon. For me, most of it is just it's just one-offs. Some of them are, what I mean? There's really nothing to it. They're one-off fights. A lot of times they're cards that don't have much appeal at all, but they're just kind of put on just to be put on.
Also, in the Bjorn Rebney days, World Series of Fighting was the fighter-friendly place to be.
Yeah.
Well, now that Coker's there, they've lost that card completely. And not only that, when you have the Viacom backing, Rebney always had the Viacom backing, so in that sense was always a relevant player. But now that Coker's overhead and things, and he's got a much better reputation, if not just for being fighter-friendly, but for being stable, for running a good business, for being able to grow things. These other guys, they can be as friendly as they want to be, but they don't have the demonstrated record that Coker does. And so I feel like that switch really hurt him.
Yeah, and also, back in the day, let's say you had the IFL or Pro Elite or even Bellator.
Days.
But they all had something different to offer from the UFC.
True.
Pro Elite had the women, the IFL had the teams, Bellator and the ring, and Bellator had the tournaments. They all had something different. What does World Series of Fighting have different than the UFC or Bellator these days? Nothing. Even RFA and those guys, they're the feeder league and all that. They have a gimmick, so to speak. They don't have it. And also, I have to say, all that glitters may not be gold with NBC. I feel like NBC has put them in some tough spots. Even if you look at NBCSports.com, they don't cover them. They haven't invested in MMA. They used to, but not anymore. There's no, World Series of Fighting notebook. They're not trying to make this. Even if you watch World Series of Fighting, NBCSN, I do from time to time. You don't see commercials. You don't see banners. You don't see it on the scroll. It just feels like it's a show that comes up every month or so, and they don't really put much time or effort into it.
Yeah, I think that's actually the missing piece right there. Because the one difference between one of the major differences between World Series of Fighting and say Bellator is that NBC is a name that everybody recognizes more so than Spike. Certainly Fox Sports 1 is an up and coming thing, but it's also a new thing. But NBC is a big deal. And so this could be a big deal. And again, it could be one more step in muddying the waters of, that breaking that relationship between MMA equals UFC. There's one more thing that potentially could break that, but NBC just doesn't seem to be towing its end of the load there. It seems like they put them out there and then say, okay, you guys go ahead and do what you're going to do. And we just want to, in name, have something that we call MMA, but we're not really going to get behind it. If they did, it can make a huge difference.
Right. All right, that does it for us. Great show, guys. Appreciate the insight and the time as always, and appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us, especially if you watched the show live. If you missed it or came late, the replay will be up in just a matter of moments, so do stay tuned for that. We're back next week, so we'll have a lot to talk about, a lot of interesting things, as always, going on in the world of MMA, some interesting fights this weekend. Enjoy them if you're watching, and we'll see you right back here, same time and place next week. In fact, I'm lying. Next week's show will be at noon Eastern Time live. I just got that word, so how about that? Not quite the same time.
Let me write that down.
The same place. For Luke, Jeff, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next week.